Before we get into the main story of this episode, I do want to go through some quick news updates or some stories I found kind of interesting. So the first one is with Tanya Spaulding, and this is a Jamaican beauty queen, and it was announced earlier that she died of a. And I found this super interesting because apparently 2 weeks prior, she had posted videos on social media, and she was basically saying that she felt like she was in a battle for control over her life. She felt like there were voices in her head telling her to end her life, and so that obviously happened. And it's really sad and unfortunate when you have situations like that where people are calling out for help or crying out for help and you don't realize too late that all of the signs were there. And so I don't know if this is a situation of mental illness or something else happening or going on, but this is like the second situation that I've heard of where women who were in the beauty pageant world have committed. The first one was a girl named Chelsea. I can't think of her last name, and I think she jumped out of a building and all of that stuff. And so this is just really sad to see that there are a lot of people who are struggling. So I think it's super important that we talk about mental illness, but also mental health, and making sure that people have the support systems that they need and deserve. The next story that I want to get into is J.K. Rowling. And so Emma Watson, I think, is going viral. And I saw a different video on Emma Watson. It was basically a clip of her being asked, like, hey, do you mind if a transgender person uses the same bathroom as you? And she was like, oh no, oh my gosh, whatever. So she's basically overreacting to the question and really trying to assert that this is totally okay. And so I saw a video on a different clip, and I guess this is a more recent interview on a podcast. And basically, Emma Watson is saying that I guess there's more nuance to the conversation, and she's kind of playing it in the middle and kind of recognizing that she has her own positioning, but then J.K. Rowling has her own position, and it's kind of like she's kind of moving more from the left to the center a little bit. And I guess the conversation or the question being asked right now is this authentic, or is she doing this for appearance's sake? And so that's super interesting. I know that we're still having that debate on transgenderism and kind of how that impacts women in sports and all of that stuff. And so I don't know if there is a bigger story here, but I did find that initial clip that I saw of that question that Emma Watson was being asked, and then I saw another video earlier of a more recent interview. The other video that I wanted to briefly mention was the TSU video, and this is basically a video where two people are trying to do the Charlie Kirk thing, and they're going to schools and debating, and there are two men. I don't know their name. I think one of them is Cam. I'm not sure of the other one's name, but basically they're going to college campuses, and I think they actually came to UNC Charlotte. And so anyway, they also went to TSU, Tennessee State University, which is a HBCU, and apparently they did not have approval, and the school did not know that they were coming. They set up a table, had their posters, and they were debating people, and then it got crazy. And so by now you probably have seen the footage of them basically being run off campus. They were escorted by cops and police officers off the campus. The whole conversation around this situation is that they were run off, and these black people acted crazy and were threatening them, threatening violence and all of that stuff, destroying their property, whatever, right? And then on the other hand, the conversation is, well, you know, these people didn't have approval. They shouldn't have been there in the first place. They were there to rage bait and intentionally get people riled up. And I think both things can be true. They could have gone there with not so genuine reason and being provocative and controversial on purpose. I can understand them wanting to do that in order to force a conversation. On the other hand, I think that the students at the school definitely could have acted better, because this representation of what you guys did in the video, that is what people see when they watch the video. They don't see like, hey, they were forced to act like this or they were agitated. They just see people acting foolish and doing crazy stuff. And so that is a bad look in that sense. And I think that TSU, they also posted a statement, and they were basically saying, hey, you know, everyone acted professionally and nobody did anything crazy. And you can kind of see from the video that's not the truth. They knocked the person's posters down, they stole it, ran away with it, that sort of stuff. And I think they were even throwing stuff at the car. And so this, for all intents and purposes, turned into a mob of sorts. And so that is crazy, because on one hand, you could say that this situation shouldn't have happened, but it also didn't have to escalate the way that it did, to where there was a mob and you're forcing people off campus, and then it's just a bad look all around, regardless of who is in the right or wrong here. Now, the other thing I want to get into is Erika Kirk. So she did make an appearance on the Charlie Kirk show, and I really like that she showed up fresh-faced, and then she also sounded like her normal self. Like, it sounded like she was talking in her normal voice, compared to the speech that she gave 2 days after Charlie Kirk's assassination, and then the speech that she gave at the memorial. I know that both people think that the speeches were kind of performative, or she was just acting in a sense. And so what I picked up on was, yes, it did seem performative at times, but it also sounded like she wasn't using her real voice. And I only realized that when I heard her on the Charlie Kirk show, because that just sounded like her normal voice, and she was obviously smiling and happy, but she's also going through something really traumatic and life-altering, right? And so just being able to show up and smile and talk about her husband the way that she did and all of that stuff really does take a lot of strength. But I think what I wanted to focus on is just how different she sounded. And I think that if she had sounded the way that she sounded in today's episode of the Charlie Kirk show, I think that people would have connected with that more, because a lot of people loved her speech, but the other people are saying, you know, this feels a little bit too dramatic, this feels like she's acting, it feels like a performance, and all of this stuff. And so people are really dissecting what she's saying, what she's doing, what she's wearing, and how she's behaving. But I really like the version that showed up on the show today, because that just seems more like a normal person who is just opening up her life to us and showing us what she's going through while honoring her husband's memory. Okay, so moving on, getting into the rest of the episode, I really wanted to focus on kind of different news updates, but then I saw this video that Amir Odom was doing, and he basically went on the Dear Gay Black Men podcast, and this is not something that I'm familiar with, and obviously this content is not for me. I'm not a man and I'm not gay, so that just tells you right there that this content is not for me. But I also wanted to watch it just because I know who Amir Odom is and I'm familiar with his content. And they also kind of got into the whole Charlie Kirk of it, because they're kind of responding to his video where he is defending Charlie Kirk and saying that he's not a racist. And so I was interested in the video for that aspect of it. However, I only got about 20 minutes in of the interview, because it was just not something that I could continue watching based on what I was hearing in the first 20 minutes, and so we're going to talk about it. So first, let's start with the host. I don't know if his name is Jay or Jai, so I'm just going to refer to him as the host so I don't mess up his name. And so basically the host was saying that he felt like there was this idea that Charlie Kirk created this environment where he's basically dictating to everyone else how they should live. And what I find funny about that is because when you think about preachers or pastors, that's what they do. They're reading the Bible and they're telling you their interpretation of the Bible and what they think you should do and all of that stuff. And we don't always mind it or kind of push back against it when preachers do that unless they do something crazy. And so as a response to the whole Charlie Kirk stuff, there are a lot of pastors who are being called out either because they didn't speak about Charlie Kirk or just the act of violence against him, or they outright just called him racist and condemned him and all of that stuff, right? And so in that sense, people who are kind of telling other people to live, they are doing that from a certain position, and it's usually government officials, pastors, that sort of thing, right? And even your parents was telling little kids, young kids, minors, what they can and can't do. But getting back to the idea of Charlie Kirk basically dictating how other people can live their lives, I don't see it that way, because I don't see what's wrong with telling people to be with one person, to get married, to have a nuclear family, and to want to get a job or achieve anything based on your merit, because at the end of the day, that is what Charlie Kirk stood for. Now, I want to give a general example of what it means to dictate how other people live their lives. The host gave an example, and he said that basically marriage is between a man and a woman, and so gay people cannot get married because they're the same sex. They're not a man and a woman. And the idea of a man getting married to a woman, that comes from the Bible. So in that sense, is your argument with the Bible or the government? The Bible is really where we get that idea of marriage from, and then it was made a legal institution. On top of that, basically, the way that our laws are written, our constitution, that is rooted in the Bible and religion. And so what I find super interesting is that we know that Charlie Kirk is super religious. We know that he's preaching, he's having these conversations from that lens. And so I don't know if the issue is a person or if it's the Bible and the government more so than it is Charlie Kirk himself. Now, in a general sense, you do have a standard or a reference point for how things should go. So the standard or the reference point is that a man dates a woman. You have heterosexual relationships, and then obviously you can have deviations, and those deviations can be good or bad. To give another example that's not quite in regards to sexuality, I do want to talk about just the general idea of having kids and sending them to school. So when you have kids, you are expected to educate your kids, whether that's sending them to public school, private school, or homeschooling them. So if you have a kid and you don't educate them, meaning you don't send them to public school, you don't send them to private school, and you don't homeschool them, you are failing to give your kid an education. And what is going to happen? CPS is going to come to your door. Why? Because the standard is that all kids should be getting some sort of education. They should be going to school and learning and all of that stuff. And so when you aren't providing that to your kid and you're preventing them from being able to get an education, you're going to get in trouble because that's not the right thing to do. That's not the standard. And to give a personal example, just so that we're not talking about sexuality being black and all of that stuff, I have a hearing loss. So the standard is that most people can hear. The fact that I cannot hear means that I don't fit the standard of what's expected for a healthy child, right? And so from that lens, there are a lot of things that I can't do because I have a hearing loss. For example, when I was taking a health class, we had a ride along in a fire truck. I was not able to do that because my hearing loss was a liability. So if there was an emergency and they needed to give instructions quickly, I would not have been able to interpret or understand what they were saying, which would have been a delayed reaction on my part, and then I could be in the way and all of that stuff, right? And so that's not something that would have been a safe environment for myself and other people. And so in giving these examples, my point is to say that standards matter. We do need a reference point in order to understand how the world should look and how it should function. When you don't have any standards and you allow things to just be however, whatever way you see fit, then you don't really know what other people are supposed to be doing, what they're doing in a general sense, and that just makes it a very difficult world to live in. That's why we have rules, we have standards for how you can behave as far as the 10 Commandments, all of that stuff, the Bill of Rights and all of that stuff as far as your rights and what you can and what you are entitled to in this country, right? And so there is a standard, and if you deviate from that, sometimes it can be good or bad. Now, the problem becomes when you know that there's a standard and you deviate from it. Now, sometimes it's by choice and other times you have no control over it. But there are some situations where you can't really challenge the standard because it's kind of selfish or it just really doesn't make sense to force other people into that. And so as an example of my hearing loss example, if I cannot go in a fire truck for a ride along because of my hearing loss, it would be stupid for me to try to take that to court and say, hey, you need to allow people with hearing losses to ride in fire trucks and put everybody else's safety at risk and all of that stuff, right? That doesn't really make sense. That's not a fair argument. It's not worth going to court over that because at the end of the day, I want to be safe and I want to make sure that other people are safe. On the other hand, when it comes to Charlie Kirk, we know that he is very religious, but I haven't really heard any example or clip of him forcing other people to be religious as well. It's more about having certain values and wanting to live your life a certain way, whether that's being with one person, getting married and having a nuclear family, and just generally behaving well in society, right? So I don't think those are super complicated or super controversial things to talk about. So from that aspect, I don't really get the controversy around Charlie Kirk from a general high-level standpoint. You should be able to agree with those things. You should want to aspire to those things because that just creates a healthier society. Moving on, the host also said that some clips of Charlie Kirk's were difficult to listen to or they were racially charged. Now, I only remember seeing one or two clips that were kind of not necessarily difficult to listen to, but I just didn't agree with the behavior. So one clip was when he was talking about the 3 or 4 black women that he named. Michelle Obama was one, but Shirley Jackson and Ketanji Brown objections. Basically, he was saying you're not smart enough for your position. He was talking about specific women. I didn't like the whole thing where he rolled his R's to say the racist word. It just felt like he was doing too much in that scene. And then the other one that I didn't like was when there was two different clips where he was talking to Black people, and one guy was like, hey, you know, when I go to certain places they give me looks. He's talking about white people looking at him funny. And then the other one was the kid who was saying that he experienced like 4 or 5 hate crimes in one night and didn't report it and didn't want to report it. And so in both situations, Charlie was like, hey, you know, you're lying, I don't believe you, and blah, blah, blah. And so I didn't really like that of denying people's experiences and not kind of having empathy or just acknowledging how uncomfortable those situations would have been, regardless of whether or not you believe him. Right now, the 4 or 5 hate crime things in one night is kind of crazy. Many people may not believe that, right? But at the same time, you do want to acknowledge people's experiences. You don't want to go around just pretending or denying that other people actually experience these things, because they do. The other thing that was mentioned was this idea that Charlie Kirk only platforms or elevates Black people who fit what he believes or his worldview. And I disagree with that, because I think that that's common sense to kind of align yourself with people who agree with you or people who share your values. I don't think many people only surround themselves with people who disagree with them. And so in that sense, I feel like it's a unfair statement, because objectively it is true. You do surround yourself with people who think like you, who share values, because that just makes for a more cohesive environment. But I think that the reasons why he's stating that this is the case is not necessarily fair, and it's kind of misleading. I also think that this is not an accurate statement, because Charlie Kirk didn't just surround himself with people who thought like him. He did not live in a bubble. He went outside of his bubble to engage and have conversations with people he knew did not think the way that he did or did not share his values. And so in that sense, you can't say that he's only surrounding himself with people who think like him, or he's only willing to help people who think like him. Like, he gave a lot of people opportunities to come to the mic to debate him and have a conversation. He's platforming so many people and giving them the opportunity to share with the world how they think, how they perceive things, and how they even debate in conversation, right? And so that's not just something that he did for Black people. There were people of all races and genders who came up to the mic to have a conversation with him. And to go a step further, the host also said that he felt like Charlie Kirk just had Black people on a plantation, which I think is really crazy, because 1, he didn't force people to work for him. 2, he didn't force people to advocate for him. The people who are speaking out on his behalf are doing so because of either the fact that they know him in real life, or they've seen enough footage, content, clips, videos of him to understand that he's not a racist and he's not someone who is just kind of looking out for himself and only trying to help certain people. He's really trying to spread his message as far and wide as he can. And if you agree with him, cool. If you don't, cool. You can think whatever you want, but you should at least be open to debating and having that conversation, even if it doesn't change your views. Now, there is something that the host said that I do kind of agree with, and he was basically saying that conservatism is a one-way street, and I've always heard that people get more conservative as they get older, which makes sense. When you're young, you do crazy stuff, you might experiment a little bit more, but when you get older, you settle down and you kind of see life differently, especially when you have kids and you want them to not experience the bad things that you've had to experience. You generally want better for them. And there are some parents who are going to be very liberal with their kids, they let them do whatever. And then there's other parents who are going to be like, hey, you know, you need more discipline, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do, that sort of thing. And so I think it's natural for people to shift their views as they get older and to become more conservative. However, I don't think that means that people can't kind of compromise on certain issues. But in a general sense, I do agree that people, as they get older, they become more conservative and more traditional in a sense. And I really love the point that Amir made where he said that he wanted diversity in terms of thought versus appearance, because if you have 5 people who think the same way but they just look different, that's not really going to get you anywhere. That's the echo chamber. However, if you have 5 people who think differently, that is going to be a more interesting conversation if you are willing to have a conversation with people who don't think like you do. Now, moving on to the topic of being gay, this is where I lost interest in the conversation, and I was really struggling to keep up with wanting to watch the rest of this interview. And what made me lose interest in the conversation was there was this kind of effort or this just vibe of diminishing what words mean and making it difficult to even understand what was being talked about. And so I have a lot of kudos for Amir in this conversation, because just the conversation at this point was really difficult, because if words mean nothing, then we don't even have the same understanding of what we're saying, right? And so that makes the conversation super difficult. And this goes back to what I was saying about standards and reference points. You need something that you can refer back to that gives a common understanding of a word, of a situation, of a concept, so that you understand what is being talked about and you can form your opinions off of that. If we all have different opinions on what a word means or who someone stood for, I think that makes things complicated. Like at one point he was saying that people can have two different definitions of who Charlie Kirk was. Generally that's a misleading concept, because there's Charlie Kirk, who he was and what he stood for. Those are kind of known things, and then it's your opinion of him and those things that changes. So you do not determine who Charlie Kirk was. You can determine your opinion of him based on what you know about him, right? And so I think that's the only thing that I would push back on in terms of that statement or that comment that he made in saying that people can have two different definitions for who Charlie Kirk was. So it's more of a word choice and just not liking how he framed that. Now, this is where I got super frustrated when they were talking about what it means to be gay, because heterosexual and gay have always been about who you go to bed with. Heterosexual, you're going to bed with a person of the opposite gender. Gay, you're going to bed with a person of the same gender. These are things that should be known and obvious and common sense. And so the host brought up, like, gay means one thing to me, but it can mean something else to you, which I thought was really crazy, because again, if words can mean different things depending on who's saying it, nobody knows what anybody's talking about, right? And so I do disagree with the idea that if you are a man and you're gay, that doesn't mean that you are gay because you like what's between someone's legs. I felt like that was really just super confusing. Like, if you're a man and you're gay, that means that you like what's between that person's legs, right? Otherwise you would be with a woman. Or if you didn't care what was between someone's legs, you would be bi, because you don't have a preference, right? So if you have a preference, you are either heterosexual or you're straight. If you don't have a preference, you're bi. And so that may be a weird statement, but that was just my kind of initial thoughts to what was said, and then also I'm adding some things that are coming to me now as I'm talking about this. And so I just found it super confusing when he was saying that for him, gay wasn't about what was between his partner's legs, it was more about who the person was. And I think what also added to the confusion, which he was saying that people can have different definitions of how somebody identifies as a man. And so I feel like that's more about traits or personalities. Like, men are men because they have and I think when you talk about how someone is as a man, you're talking about how they appear to the world in terms of strength, how they lead, how they dress, how they style their hair, how they talk, all of that stuff, right? And so in the context of women who are attracted to men, they can have their ideal man. It's a man, but they all have different things that they may value or want to see in a man that they're dating. And so I feel like he's approaching more from that lens versus focusing on genitals, because again, if you don't care about what's between someone's legs, I feel like you're bi in that sense. You're not gay or heterosexual. And then to add to this confusion of what it means to be a man or what someone looks like when they identify as a man, they brought in this conversation of black. And this is something that I talked about in one of my other videos, where black means African American, but I also use it to mean other people who are basically not white. So people with darker skin than white people. So I'm not including Asians or Hispanics. I'm just talking about people that you would typically associate with Africa, right? So, or Jamaica, the Caribbean, whatever, right? And so with that in mind, he was basically talking about how you wouldn't say someone who's black who has a white parent is not black. Obviously, that's kind of silly. They're black, right? But I think that he was conflating things a little bit, because when you think of what a man is, usually you're talking about his genitals. That's the one thing that is consistent that identifies men as men. Now, if you are talking about different traits that men have, some men are more feminine, some men are more masculine, some men are really athletic, some are not, some are really dumb, some are smart. So what it means to be a man can vary, but all men have that one thing in common as far as their genitals. So anyway, I just thought it was super confusing how he was one saying that gay can mean different things to different people, how you identify as a man can mean different things to different people, and then also how he brought in the topic of who's considered black. I felt like these were all things that just made the conversation super difficult to follow, because at that point, basically, words didn't have any real definition. There was no standard for these definitions, and so it just made the conversation difficult to even have, because you don't really understand what someone is saying in a deeper sense of the conversation. So I knew that I did not want to continue listening to this, because I knew that I was just going to get more frustrated with what was being said. Going into the topic of racism and racist, and so basically they started this conversation talking about Charlie Kirk's rhetoric and that a lot of people think that he was racist. One thing that Amir kept saying was that there's real racism, and so to give an example of this, I did a video, Good Blacks versus Bad Black, and then I also did a video on the controversy with an all-white town, and basically in one of those videos somebody left a comment saying, hey, no self-respecting white person would want to live around black people. So we can all agree that that's a pretty racist statement, and that infers, implies, signifies a dislike, a strong dislike for black people, right? And so there's nothing that you can point to that Charlie Kirk said that is in that same vein and extreme level of racism. So by that standard, Charlie Kirk, if we're talking about this is the parameter for what it means to be racist, Charlie Kirk is not racist, because nothing that he said is equal to that comment that I just mentioned. So I think that when we talk about what Charlie Kirk has said, we can acknowledge that he's probably said some unflattering things that have hurt people's feelings, but in the sense of real racism, telling people, hey, you should want to get a job based on merit instead of your skin color, that's not racism. That's just saying you're capable of doing better. You're capable of doing things on merit based on your actual abilities. You don't need anything handed to you, and you shouldn't want anything handed to you. Now, a lot of people can say, oh, well, you're white, you have privilege, blah, blah, blah. But I think at the end of the day, people do want to be able to say, hey, I accomplished this. I did this on my own. I got this job because of my own hard work. It wasn't given to me and all of this stuff, right? And so I don't take any issue with him saying that, especially because I am someone who talks about my achievements in that way. Anything that I've gotten, I've worked hard for, and if you disagree with that, that's your opinion. I don't feel that way about myself. I know that I worked hard and put everything I had into accomplishing whatever goal I set for myself. So I really want to stress that when we talk about real racism, we're talking about people who have negative views about an entire race or group of people, and they do not want to associate with those people. Like a real racist, they would not want to involve themselves with the people that they hate or dislike, right? And we know that Charlie Kirk was surrounded by black people, he employed black people, he was friends with black people. So it's very difficult to be a racist in that sense, because you can't have negative views about somebody and then constantly surround yourself with those people willingly, right? So either you become less racist or you were never racist to begin with. And so I think that that's something that needs to be said, because again, this idea of him basically only employing the black people who thought the way that he did, like, that's common sense. You employ people, you surround yourself with people who share the same values that you do. If they happen to be black, cool. If they happen to be white, cool, right? But the focus is on the values and not your skin color, which is the whole point that he was making about the black pilots thing. He was saying that basically when you announce to the world, hey, we're going to focus on this criteria and we want to get more black people in these seats, in these positions, that does lead you, as an unintended consequence, that does lead you to ask questions when you see those people in those positions. If this had never been announced that, hey, we're focusing on this criteria, I don't think anybody would have thought twice on whether or not they had a black pilot. It would have just been a pilot. And so when you have things that are focused on race and they're obvious and they're intentional, that just makes everyone else notice it more. And so I think that's the real point of what he was saying. But if you're not willing to listen to what he said in its full context, and then also apply logic to what he said and understand it in a much deeper way, you're going to completely miss the point and the message of what he was saying. Alrighty, so that was all that I wanted to talk about in this video. I'm not sure what you guys think about any of the topics that I covered. If you did watch the interview that Amir did on the Dear Gay Black Man podcast, please let me know your thoughts on it. If you found something super helpful or interesting about it, definitely share that in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.